This is passage 3. It's a research passage. We know it's a research passage because it says experiment 1, experiment 2. You're going to want to spend some time examining the passage because in our DRC approach, research passages you want to read. Not necessarily carefully read, but you want to read at least enough to know the process and the differences in the experiments. So I like to skim the intro paragraph. To me, that just helps to know what's going on. Quickly also skim the experiments, especially if there's numbered steps. You're probably going to have a question about the steps. And then look and see what's the difference in experiment 1 and experiment 2. It should take you 30 seconds to a minute to do that. You're not trying to find deep understanding, just a basic idea of what is occurring in the passage. Remember, our steps to answering these questions is to read and reread. You need to read the question on your own first, and then we're going to do the reread as you've already read it once. That's a good approach if you have time to do on test day as well. Read and then reread. How many times in experiment 2 was a bottle placed into the box that was maintained at 10 degrees Celsius? So experiment 2 is here, and it says the procedure in experiment 1 was repeated. So now we have to pull up experiment 1. And we're looking for how many times the bottle was placed in the box. We see the picture there at 10 degrees Celsius. So the bottle was placed in the box in step 2. So that's 1 time. And then in step 6, they repeated it 28 times. So 28 plus 1 is 29. The answer is C. Suppose that in experiment 2, so put your finger on experiment 2, the bottle containing water stored at 50 degrees Celsius, so put your finger on the 50 degrees Celsius line, had been reused 35 times. So we're 35 times. So from 35, 28 to 35 is going to be the same distance from 21 to 28. So it's going to be about there. At that number, the concentration would have been. So we can see this continues to trend upwards. And we know it's going to be greater than 330, so your answer has to be J. Okay, number 15. Number 15, we're using experiment 2. So put your finger on experiment 2. Assume the maximum acceptable concentration of sp3 in drinking water is 6,000. This concentration, so 6,000, is how many times is great. So we're going to be dividing that concentration by something. As the concentration of sp3 in water stored at 50 degrees Celsius, we're using the 50 degrees Celsius line, that was reused 21 times. So put your finger on the 21 times and go up and see where that hits the 50 degrees Celsius line, and you should get 300. So 6,000 divided by 300 is 20, and so your answer is C. You're going to have to be able to do basic calculations on the science test. Add, subtract, multiply, divide. And you don't get a calculator unless you have special accommodations. Number 16, which of the experimental conditions where you use both experiments resulted in an SP concentration of 140, so the concentration 140, in a bottle that had been reused 14 times, so 14 times. So when we see that, we see this spot right here where they cross, and that's the 10 degrees Celsius line. So we know it's going to be F or G. Now, is that UV light or visible light? And the experiment says it's only visible light, so visible light, so your answer is G. The substance composing the bottles tested in the experiment is best classified as which of the following? So this is a knowledge question. You can see that this bottle is made up of PET, and you may know just from your science knowledge that the answer is B, it's a polymer. If not, you might be able to process of eliminate to determine which one it is. An alloy is metal. Well, this is not metal, it's plastic. It's not an element because an element is a unique substance. And salt is NaCl. That's not the chemical formula given here, the chemical compound. So a process of elimination, you might also get it down to B. You're going to have 1 to 4 questions on the test that require some sort of science knowledge to answer them, and this is one of them. Number 18, suppose that in experiment 1, put your finger on experiment 1, at a temperature of 20, so that's going to be between the 10 and the 30 line. So right there, so just draw a line right in the middle, had been tested at a reused number of 21. So that's going to be right there, reused number of 21. The concentration would most likely have been. So we see where it comes together right here. And so that's going to put us, to me, about 300. We don't see 300, but we see 275. We know it's not going to be any lower than 275. And so J has to be the answer. Did experiment 1 and 2, respectively, that means in order, take more than 1 day or less than 1 day to complete? So let's look at experiment 1 first. And we see in step 2, it took 16 hours for the first bottle. But what about the other bottles they did? Well, we see in step 6 that the steps repeated, steps 2 through 5, 28 times. So that's definitely more than 1 day. Let's look at experiment 2. Experiment 2 says the procedure in experiment 1 was repeated, so they're doing the same thing. So the answer would have to be more in both of them. So your answer is A.